So to kick things off, I'm going to ask you guys to listen to three different instruments and try to determine what they are. Actually, to kick things off, we're going to do something a little bit more interesting. In the 1950s, the composer Pierre Schaeffer performed what are known as the cut bell experiments. He recorded a number of orchestral instruments on tape. Then, using a razor blade, he cut the attacks off of some instruments and stitched them onto the sustains of others. Doing this, he showed the importance of the attack in timbral identification of different instruments. I've recreated his experiments using modern software. Each of these sets has an attack from one instrument and a sustain from another. You guys try to guess what instruments the attack and the sustain are originally from. Here we go. Here's the first set. Here's the second set. Here's the third set. And here are the results. Let me know in the comments if you got them all right or not. So I played all three of these instruments at the same pitch, the same note. I played them for roughly the same length of time, and I'm hoping you guys heard them all at roughly the same loudness. So how were you able to differentiate them? The answer is timbre, also referred to as the color of sound. Now, timbre is defined pretty broadly as the attribute of sound that distinguishes sounds of equal pitch, loudness, location, and duration. And it plays an important role in auditory identification. So, timbre is how you differentiate different materials. So, the difference between a plate shattering and a metal pan dropping. How you differentiate different voices. So, the difference between the voice of a close friend versus that of your doctor. It lets you differentiate different instruments. So the difference between brass, woodwinds, strings, assuming that they're all the same pitch and loudness and duration. And timbre can be described using words such as harsh, smooth, sharp, rough, and it plays a really important role in speech. So we actually use timbre to differentiate different vowel sounds. So the difference between an ah and an oo sound, as well as the difference between consonant sounds. So between a th, that's the th, and a f, that's an f sound. Extremely important in speech, but also very important in music because timbre is a lot of what makes music sound good. So unfortunately, at this point in my presentation, my recording software cut out. So I had to rip the audio and video directly from the Zoom recording. Take the opportunity to listen to how the timbre of my voice changes from section to section. Higher quality audio tends to have more higher frequency information than lower quality audio. For the demos, I've removed the lower frequency harmonics from my voice. Listen and see if you can hear it. Musicians can utilize timbre in all sorts of ways. You can choose what kinds of instruments and tones you want in your music. You can use EQs, equalizers, to affect the overtone series of your sounds. Musicians also have a high degree of control over the temporal dimension of timbre. For example, on a guitar, we control the attack by controlling how we strike the strings. We control the sustain with vibrato. Each instrument has its own form of timbre control. The way you control your timbre plays a large part in how your music is perceived. A confident musician's playing will come across in the attack. All right, so let's talk about the physical nature of timbre. There's two main dimensions to timbre. The first is the spectral dimension. The second is the temporal. Spectral referring to the overtone series of a sound. So this results from the fact that different materials typically have different densities. So they vibrate differently when they're struck. This causes differences in their overtone series. There's also a temporal dimension to timbre, the way a sound changes in time. This involves the attack, the sustain, and the decay, and is very important in identifying different instruments, as we'll also see. So here's the spectral dimension, and the main part of the spectral dimension is the overtone. Sounds in the real world don't vibrate only at a single frequency, but at many frequencies at the same time. And those upper layers of sound frequencies are known as the overtones. So I'm going to give you guys a demonstration of how overtones can affect the timbre of a sound. In this demonstration, I'm going to use a synthesizer to show you how the overtone series of a sound affects its timbre. Listen to how the sound changes as I increase the number of harmonics. We'll start with the fundamental frequency. As the number of harmonics increases, the sound becomes brighter. Brighter sounds have more higher frequency harmonics, while removal of these higher frequency harmonics can result in sounds that have a dull or muted character. So that's how the overtones of a sound affects the way it sounds, its timbre. So different instruments have different overtone profiles. We can see on this diagram, in the top left, oboes have peaks, have higher energies at the fourth harmonic, whereas clarinets here on the right have higher energies at odd harmonics. So the first, the third, the fifth, the seventh. Flutes have a pretty steady decreasing energy levels with increasing harmonics. And trumpets, you can see here, have higher energy at their second harmonic. This is the main reason different instruments sound different. But that's not the full picture because there's also a temporal dimension to timbre. Now, the temporal dimension involves the attack, the sustain, and the decay. The attack is the noise-like quality of an instrument being struck. So, for example, when you pluck a guitar string, that the initial pluck creates a sound that helps you identify the instrument as a guitar. When you press a piano key, the sound of the hammer hitting the string creates a sound that isn't really musical, but helps you identify it as a piano. The second part of the temporal dimension is the steady state or the sustain. And this is the continuation of the note after the initial attack. This part is mostly based on the overtone series, which we just talked about. Lastly, the decay or the flux, how the sound changes and fades away. If you think about two crash cymbals in a band, when they crash, they create a sound that vibrates, that wobbles in space, and that also helps you identify it as being a crash cymbal. Different instruments also have different levels of decay. For example, a piano, the sound decays quickly, whereas a trumpet can be sustained for as long as you can blow into it. The cut bell experiment that I demonstrated at the beginning of the video shows the importance of the attack and the sustain in timbral identification of different instruments. When the attack of one instrument was stitched onto the sustain of another, the resulting sound might sound more like the instrument from the attack, the instrument from the sustain, or a completely new instrument altogether. So where does this happen in the brain? Most studies that have looked into timbre focus on the auditory cortex. Timbre begins as the spectral and temporal properties of the sound that reaches the ear. The signal travels through the vestibular cochlear nerve and up the brainstem. Timbre is multi-layered and multidimensional, so investigating its neural processing is very difficult. Most studies that examine timbre begin at the auditory cortex. fMRI studies suggest that there is a network of multiple areas at work involving Heschel's gyrus, the planum temporale, the superior temporal gyrus, and the superior temporal sulcus. It used to be thought that only the right temporal lobe was involved in timbre processing. This is no longer the case. Evidence points to both the left and right temporal lobe involvement. However, there is likely a functional asymmetry between the two lobes. A 2002 fMRI study shows a difference in location of activation between the two lobes. Lesion studies show us that a right temporal lobe lesion completely removes the ability to discern timbre, while a left temporal lobe lesion leaves some ability to process timbre. Currently, it seems like the right temporal lobe is specialized for timbre processing, but that both hemispheres are important. This is still being researched.
Lastly, we're going to talk about timbre deficiency. So, cochlear implants, hearing aids. People with cochlear implants have a more difficult time discerning pitches and timbres than those with normal hearing. Why is this? Well, let's take a look at how a cochlear implant works. On the left side of this diagram is the outside of the head. You can see the microphone here, which takes in the sound. It processed by this bit here, and the electrical signal is sent to this transmitter, which sends it to a receiver, which is surgically implanted inside the bone of your head. Now, the receiver sends that electrical signal down this wire here, which feeds into the cochlea, that spiral chamber. So it simulates the role of those hair cells and sends electrical signals down the vestibular cochlear nerve. However, that wire typically only has between 12 through 22 electrodes. Compare that to the thousands of hair cells that are present in a healthy cochlea, and you can begin to understand why people with cochlear implants have trouble with fine discrimination of pitch as well as discrimination of timbre. Cochlear implants are wonderful devices that give people with seemingly permanent damage the ability to understand speech. But people with cochlear implants do have problems enjoying and listening to music. Typically, they may enjoy music that is more rhythmically based rather than melodically based. So, as an overview, timbre is the aspect of sound separate from pitch, loudness, and duration that helps us identify different sounds and helps us understand speech. It's dependent on its spectral properties, so the overtone profiles of a sound, as well as the temporal properties, so how the sound changes through time. Different instruments have different overtone profiles, and this is what distinguishes types of instruments from each other, as well as individual instruments. So think about a low quality instrument versus a high quality instrument. What's the difference between your $500 Squire and a $2,000 Fender? The answer is the Overtone series. Takeaway from this presentation is that timbre is very important, but it's also only one aspect of music. Good music can be made with low quality instruments as long as the other elements of your music are good. In essence, the melodies or harmonies, your pitch, the dynamics, the loudness, and the note placement or the rhythm. All of these combined create good music.